Okay. Hello friends, welcome to another video. Thank you for joining me today. I tried to make this video yesterday, but I am getting over a cold and the audio quality was pretty bad and it was a little bit lengthy and my editing apps kept crashing because of the length and all of the cuts I had to make. So I'm just gonna do this again. Today we're gonna go over a report released by translifeline.org. This report is, I believe it was released this year, and I will leave a link to it in the description. It's about 988, the national hotline for suicide prevention. You've probably heard of 988 if you live in the United States. You may have been recommended to call 988 if you are experiencing an emotional or mental health crisis. So I will read the trigger warning at the top of the report, and it will apply to this video as well, since this is going to be a summary of the content discussed in this report. So this report discusses suicide and suicidal ideation, self-harm, mental illness, violations of consent, police violence, physical and sexual assault, racism, transphobia, forced psychiatric intervention, and death. And some quotes from study participants use profanity. So keep that in mind if you choose to read this in full, and keep that in mind going forward with this video. If you're not in a good headspace for this right now, I totally get it. You can skip this one. But this is some important information, and I would like to get it out there. So this report is about the National Suicide Hotline. It's called The Problem with 988. How America's largest hotline violates consent, compromises safety, and fails the people. It's 64 pages long. It's got 5 chapters. Chapter 1 covers how 988 operates. The 988 landscape, that is, what 988 is, how many hotlines are under its policies, the safety assessments that 988 carries out, non-consensual emergency interventions that 988 carries out, the role of the hotline operator, and the fact that 988 has been dodging requests for public data. In Chapter 2, the report discusses policing and criminalization, the role of police and law enforcement in mental health care crisis response. The 3rd chapter covers forced hospitalizations, the consequences of psychiatric hospitalization. The 4th chapter covers privacy and location tracking, how 988 tracks your location, shares your data, uses your data, stores it, all of this stuff. And the 5th chapter is, of course, a conclusion with recommendations for a better system. So let's start with Chapter 1, how 988 operates, a guide to hotline policies and practices. All hotlines within the 988 network, and there are over 200 of them, basically they join for funding. And it's a good thing for these small hotlines dotted around the country to receive federal and state level funding, which is what they get when they join the 988 network. However, in order to join the 988 network, they are contractually obligated to employ emergency interventions for help seekers who are labeled as imminent risk, with or without their consent. So if you are a small grassroots local suicide prevention hotline, you can be that, but you're probably not going to make it. So you want federal funding, you want state level funding. You join the 988 network, and now you are a 988 affiliated hotline. And so you must follow their rules and policies, including employing these imminent risk emergency interventions, oftentimes without the help seeker's consent. So the 988 number, you may remember, it came about, I think, a couple years ago. It used to be just a regular old phone number, just a full, 8-digit or whatever it is phone number. They're more than 8 digits. Whatever, I can't do math right now, but they reduced it to 3 numbers. They got the 988 number, and ironically, this was because, partially at least, they wanted an easy number for people to call, similar to 911, a 3-digit, easy-to-remember number that people could call instead of 911 when there's a mental health crisis happening. So you can call the mental health police, essentially. They would replace the police in these sort of calls. But the implementation of 988 has, in many ways, resulted in a strengthening of the relationship between mental health crisis care and carceral systems, putting even more help seekers at risk of interactions with the police and harmful interventions. 988 has been dodging requests for public data. So the research team for this report, and thank you to all of the researchers and writers who put all of this information together and did all of this work. Thank you so much. You are very appreciated. Our research team solicited 988 officials for data about emergency interventions using Freedom of Information Act requests. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, is the federal body that oversees 988. They were dodging requests. Most hotlines contacted did not fill out the data survey, and Vibrant, being Vibrant Emotional Health, which is 988's administrator, Vibrant in particular employed a variety of tactics to rebuff the researchers' efforts at gaining information, including changing points of contact, offering to send information and never doing so, and denying the existence of requested data. After 2 years, SAMHSA finally acknowledged the FOIA requests. So you join this 988 network, and now you've got to follow their policies, including these non-consensual interventions, these emergency interventions. So this process begins when a help seeker is assessed to be at imminent risk, a status assigned by hotlines when an individual is perceived to be at risk of harming themselves or others. These interventions often involve sending law enforcement, EMS, mobile crisis teams, and can result in criminalization, forced psychiatric hospitalization, and other harmful and traumatizing experiences. Even when a help seeker refuses an emergency intervention, 988 is authorized to initiate the process of location tracking and emergency response without consent. So, you can call 988, be connected to a hotline, and without your consent and knowledge, have the police sent after you anyway. You can call them and say, I don't want anybody coming here, I don't want the police showing up, I don't want a mobile crisis team, I don't want an ambulance, I don't want any of that. You can refuse to give them your location, they can still track you and find you and send police. And it's actually the police that do the tracking, so technically speaking, 988 is totally innocent according to the regulations here. 988 is reporting emergency interventions occur in less than 2% of calls. However, available data suggests this is a significant underestimation, so they're probably lying about this, and probably the number of emergency interventions is much, much higher. The state reporting the highest number of law enforcement interventions initiated by crisis hotlines placed this figure at an astonishing 17.3%, likely much higher than what 988 and SAMHSA and Vibrant are currently disclosing to the public. So what happens when somebody is assessed? They call 988, right? They call 988 because they're experiencing a mental health crisis. They're in emotional distress. This is why you would call 988. That is the only reason you would call 988. You're in emotional distress and you've been told this is the number to call. However, you can face some serious negative consequences. You can have the police sent after you. You can be forced to go to the hospital. There can be financial consequences because you'll be taken away from your job. There can be stigma associated with being forced to go to the hospital or being hospitalized even voluntarily. There can be stigma associated with having the police called on you. Your neighbors might see that. The people in the area might see that. Your family's going to see that. Your friends are going to see that. Right? And when you call 988, you might have no idea that this kind of stuff is going to be happening. You might think that you're just calling somebody to just talk. And you may end up just talking, being vulnerable, and then without your knowledge and consent, having your location tracked and having police sent to your location. This is not okay. Furthermore, these safety assessments that 988 performs to assess whether somebody is at imminent risk, they're shown to be inaccurate, misleading, and inadequate. Suicide risk assessments. So this is in a meta-analysis of 50 years of research on risk assessments. Suicide risk assessments conducted by a trained health professional were shown to be no more accurate at predicting future suicide than random guessing by someone with no training or by flipping a coin. So they're going to be assessing your risk using basically like phrenology, astrology, vibes. It's not an accurate tool that they use, and they could seriously affect the path of your future, your next few days and your next few weeks, your next few years even, with whatever decision the operator on the other end of the line makes about your level of risk. It is important to underscore that thinking about suicide, knowing how one might complete suicide, and having the means to go through with it are not reliable indicators of emergency or a need to initiate an emergency intervention. This type of assessment leaves room for significant misinterpretation, putting individuals who live with chronic suicidal ideation at higher risk of non-consensual interventions. And for this reason, people feel that they cannot be vulnerable on the line, which completely defeats the purpose of calling 988 in the first place. Because these assessments introduce the threat of an emergency intervention, our participants also reported having to play a balancing game between disclosing and withholding information to successfully navigate their calls. Here's a quote. "I always have to preface my calls with, no, I'm not a danger to myself or others, even if I am actively suicidal, so they don't call the cops. But then you have to communicate that you're in just the right amount of danger so that they don't hang up or deprioritize your call." This reverses the relationship that should be happening between the operator and the help seeker, where now the help seeker is concerned about the operator's emotions to make sure they don't get, too scared or label them as an imminent risk based on some vibes. And there are some stated criteria in the safety assessment, but as said before, we know that they're not reliable, they're not accurate. So it's basically vibes based. And so when you're on these calls as a help seeker, if you don't want to get labeled as an imminent risk and get carted off to the hospital by the cops or something, then you've got to, watch what you say. And that's not a responsibility that should be placed on the help seeker's shoulders. Another participant shared concerns about operators who may misinterpret what they share and be trigger happy or quick to initiate an emergency intervention. This emotional labor on the part of the person in crisis was not only an added barrier to receiving adequate support, but also an additional layer of stress and anxiety during a vulnerable moment. Not a surprise, not at all a surprise. Very, very unfortunate. Many participants also expressed feeling that their interactions were robotic or lacked human connection. Operators may not be trained to actually connect on a personal level with the person on the other end. They're trained to assess risk and call the authorities, call the appropriate authorities, get the person in the hospital. That is sort of when you call 988, it sort of feels that way, that the whole point of the call is to get an ambulance to you. They just keep asking over and over, would you like me to send an ambulance? It's like, no. But even if you say no, they still might. They have that power. They can do that. And it does not feel like the operator's really interested in listening. I know personally I've called 988 and I've said things to these operators before, like, I'm just looking for a real connection here. I know you're trained on your scripts and you've got to follow your policies and everything, but I don't know where else to go, and I just need a real human connection right now. I don't need the cops, I don't need a hospital, I don't need medicine. I just need, somebody that understands and can listen to me. And every single time, and I've brought this up multiple times with these operators, every single time they just go back to their script. They don't acknowledge this bid for connection at all. It's very, very strange, very robotic, very cold, and it doesn't leave me feeling like I can be vulnerable on these calls. These operators should be trained to provide some kind of peer support, or at least act like they're kind of understanding what you're saying and what you're going through. Okay, Chapter 2, Policing and Criminalization. Why cops don't belong in care. Police budgets have increased over the past several decades, and there has been a significant lack of state and federal investment in community-centered mental health support, which means that there is an over-reliance on police as the primary response to mental health crisis. So when funding is invested in non-police crisis intervention, large amounts are allocated to short-term solutions, such as creating more psychiatric beds, which do little to meaningfully address the root causes of distress and trauma. So basically, the government's funding the police rather than the mental health crisis support or mental health support in general, which leads to an imbalance in the way that police are utilized, in the way that law enforcement is utilized in mental health crisis situations. The continued involvement of police in mental health crisis response is perpetuated in part by the stereotype that people in crisis are violent. However, it's quite the opposite. In fact, people with psychiatric diagnoses are far more likely to be victims of police violence during law enforcement encounters. People perceived to have a mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. So it is completely inappropriate to be calling law enforcement and getting them involved in mental health crisis cases. Completely inappropriate. Many help seekers do not realize that calling 988 could lead to an encounter with the police. They don't tell you that when you call them. 88% of survey participants who said that they were unlikely to call a hotline in the future expressed not wanting to interact with emergency responders, including police, as a reason. People have reported interactions with police that ranged from unpleasant to violent, including threats of violence, having weapons pointed at them, being intimidated into consenting to searches, homophobic, transphobic slurs, probably racist slurs, and also sexual assault. So there has been some attempt to mitigate the effects of police involvement, including attempting to implement non-police emergency intervention measures. There's three main approaches that have been tried. There's crisis response training for police officers. There's co-response, which involves both police and mental health professionals showing up to the scene. And mobile crisis teams, which is completely non-police, involves first responders, such as social workers, counselors, EMTs, crisis workers, etc. There is a crisis intervention team program, CIT programs. This is what they're using to train the police. It's a 40-hour training, aims to increase an officer's understanding of mental health conditions and symptoms, develop de-escalation skills and practices, and promote knowledge and awareness of community mental health resources. So while studies have suggested that CIT-trained officers are more likely than non-CIT-trained officers to provide referrals to mental health services, findings on the influence of CIT on arrest rates have been more mixed. So CIT-trained officers were more likely to transport individuals to a mental health facility, which could result in involuntary commitment, which is another form of incarceration. And a later chapter in this report will cover that more in depth. But basically what they're saying here is that they trained police officers to have more de-escalation skills and more knowledge about mental health, and all it did was take their arrests and transfer them. Instead of going to jail, now these people are going to the hospital instead. Existing data has not shown that CIT actually reduces the use of force in practice, and it does not adequately address officers' stigma toward people with perceived mental illness. So co-response uses an interprofessional team. This includes both mental health professionals, such as social workers, psychiatric nurses, and police, law enforcement officials who have done CIT training. The idea is that the presence of a mental health specialist will facilitate de-escalation, but in practice, oftentimes the police arrive first, with the mental health professionals arriving after the police have already done their initial screening and probably whatever brutality and escalation that they were going to perform in the first place. Now, a growing number of cities and states have implemented mobile crisis teams, which is completely non-police, generally operated by community organizations like hospitals, health departments. They can be staffed by social workers, counselors, EMTs, nurses, peer supporters, not police, mental health and medical professionals only in these mobile crisis teams, which sounds great, but unfortunately in practice, a lot of calls are not eligible for these mobile crisis teams to be dispatched, and so they're not used, and the police are used instead. So even though there is a non-police intervention available in many places, it's often not used. The probability remains high that those labeled imminent risk will still experience police response. So, right, completely inappropriate. Like I said before, completely inappropriate to have police interfacing with mental health crisis. It just doesn't work, and it doesn't make any sense. Chapter 3, Forced Hospitalization, a jail by another name. Hotlines serve as a pipeline to unwanted psychiatric interventions, including forced hospitalization and forced medication. The terms involuntary commitment, civil commitment, and forced or involuntary hospitalization all describe a process where someone is held in a hospital without their consent. This has happened to me multiple times. In fact, a lot of what I'm talking about in this report, a lot about what this report is talking about has happened to me personally. Involuntary commitment typically involves a short-term detention, usually lasting 3 to 4 days, which can last weeks, months, or years. This is happening hundreds of thousands of times a year in the United States. There is a legal distinction between involuntary and voluntary hospitalization. However, in reality, both can be highly coercive. Some people are admitted voluntarily only because they were coerced. They felt unable to say no. They're told basically, if you don't go in voluntary, then we're going to commit you involuntarily. And then at that point, you don't have any say over your consent and your autonomy whatsoever. It was basically always presented to me as like an ultimatum of, you either go in voluntary, go into the hospital voluntarily, or we're going to force you to go in involuntarily, and that's not going to look good on your paperwork. You don't want that. Now, taking away people's autonomy and coercing them into a confinement environment does not make them feel better. In fact, perceived coercion during hospital admission has been found to increase the risk of suicide attempts after discharge. So, the United Nations in 2006 released a statement, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, advocating for the elimination of forced psychiatric treatment, as well as practices of seclusion and restraint. To date, 186 countries, excluding the United States, have ratified the CRPD, making the US among a global minority. Coercion can inflict severe pain and suffering on a person and have long-lasting effects physically and mentally, which can impede recovery and lead to substantial trauma and even death. Both the United Nations and the World Health Organization have condemned the practice of involuntary and coercive psychiatric treatment, naming them as violations of human rights and the right to health. That's right, if you have called 988, you have been forced to be hospitalized. Your human rights have been violated, according to the United Nations and the World Health Organization. So what happens in the hospital, right? You call 988 and you're forced to go to the hospital. Not such a bad thing if the hospital can actually help you, right? Well, research on experiences of psychiatric hospitalization have found that harmful and abusive experiences in the hospital setting are alarmingly common, including forced sedation, strip searches, racial and/or gender-based discrimination from hospital staff, sexual advancements from other patients. And forceful treatment that is supposed to be used as a last resort is shockingly common as well. One study found that 65% of patients had experienced handcuffed transport. I've experienced this. 59% had experienced seclusion. 34% had experienced restraint. I've experienced that. 29% had experienced physical takedowns. I've experienced that. 63% of patients witnessed traumatic events. 31% experienced physical assault, and 8% experienced sexual assault. These are meant to be physical takedowns, handcuffs, seclusion, restraint. These are meant to be last resorts, and they're being used way more often than they're supposed to be. This kind of treatment in the hospital does not actually help people. Evidence from a UK-based study suggests that the lifetime suicide risk for people who have experienced psychiatric hospitalization is highest immediately following their discharge. Women were 246 times more likely, and men were 102 times more likely to die by suicide during the week after their release. Completely backwards. Similar patterns show for adolescents. People are getting PTSD from their hospitalizations, flashbacks of their hospitalizations, bad dreams, nightmares, and basically no therapeutic effects whatsoever. Over the course of a 72-hour hold, a patient may interact with a psychiatrist just one time, the rest of the time being spent in the common room doing coloring pages and crossword puzzles. And in exchange for this treatment, they can experience economic consequences of their hospitalization, including loss of employment, unexpected ambulance and hospital bills. They can lose their job. They can receive stigma from their family and friends. Hospitalization can exacerbate the conditions under which a person might have thoughts of suicide, rarely addresses the root causes of crises, including financial struggles, lack of access to safe housing, inaccessibility of non-crisis medical care, and countless other examples of structural issues and systemic failures. And all of these things happen disproportionately more to people of color, trans people, and disabled people. One interviewee described that they had been taken to a facility that was known to be of lower quality than the one their white peers were taken to. They received inferior hospitalization, describing they got their blood drawn by a phlebotomist who had never drawn blood on a human before, and they were being used as practice. Now, this is a huge red flag. Sending mental health patients, people who are experiencing a mental health crisis, to the hospital, to a place where they can be restrained, restricted, their consent, their autonomy is all taken away. They can be denied access to quality healthcare by going to the shitty hospital. And then they get used as training and test subjects. Does this remind anybody of a particular moment in German history? Is this sounding familiar at this point? Chapter 4, Help Seeker Privacy and Location Tracking Technology. So here's where I'm going to come in with a secondary disclaimer, because this next chapter contains some very concerning information that is true according to the report, but if you have any tendency for paranoid thinking, paranoid delusions, or anxiety of that kind, you may want to be careful with this section, because it's information that could very much exacerbate a paranoid condition. So, read the chapter title, be aware of the information you're taking in, and take care of yourself first. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline specifically promotes itself as a confidential and a private resource for people in distress. However, in reality, 988 regularly violates the privacy, confidentiality, and safety of help seekers. The process of non-consensual intervention includes a violation of consent at every step. It's in the name. Sharing information from hotline conversations without a help seeker's consent, initiating processes to track and trace a help seeker's physical location without their knowledge, and sending law enforcement and other emergency responders to a help seeker's location without their awareness. Hotlines currently exist in a regulatory gap, where privacy protections like those for personal health information don't apply. Most hotline calls are answered by a mix of staff and volunteers, many of whom are not health providers and therefore are not legally required to keep health data confidential. So 988 will share your information with 911 operators in order to allow 911 to track your location. 911 itself is not the agency that currently has geolocation capacity. However, 988 administrators have been lobbying for the hotline network to have in-house geolocation capacity, in which case all 200 plus crisis centers in the 988 network would have full access to the precise location of every single 988 caller, texter, and chat user. Now, you don't want these people to have your data. The CEO of the crisis text line, which I believe is under the 988 network, was also the CEO of Loris.ai. Legally, there is no federal law explicitly prohibiting hotlines from selling or sharing user data that most help seekers assume is private. And so, anytime you used the crisis text line for a while there, the conversations on the crisis text line were being used to train Loris.ai's customer service AI software. Not even a therapy AI. They're using mental health crisis conversations non-consensually, without these people's awareness, to train a customer service AI. Not even a therapy AI. Like, are you kidding me? That's so insulting. And again, the people generally that are calling 988 don't have this information. They don't know this is happening. If you're watching this video right now and you didn't know, now you know. So 988 does have a little bit of in-house location tracking. They use your area code to route, use the first 3 digits of your phone number to route your call to the nearest 988 center, landlines, and the internet, and online chats. Well, if it's a landline, they can usually just use your address. If it's an online chat, they will use your zip code or postal code, which you have to enter before going into the chat. And in imminent risk cases, 988 operators can share IP addresses with 911 in order to determine a help seeker's location. So they will do everything they can, including contacting the police to track your location, and including lobbying the government to allow them to have more tracking capabilities. Now, obviously, this doesn't always work. If you have an area code for one particular place and then you move to another city or another state and you don't change your phone number, you're going to be routed to the place where you used to live. This happens to me. I have an out-of-state area code. I've never changed my phone number. So when a hotline operator determines that a help seeker is at imminent risk, they are required to escalate the call to a hotline supervisor, who then contacts a 911 operator. They give the 911 operator all the identifying information, area code, IP address, any personal details that you might have told them over the course of the call. And in the case of non-consensual intervention, a help seeker is not always informed that the 911 location tracking process has happened until police or other emergency responders arrive. So the police can contact your mobile provider to basically turn on certain functions of your phone, location sensing capabilities like GPS, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth, and any applications that have location services, whether or not the caller has turned them on. All mobile phone carriers and internet service providers report precise location data, and they have to do this because it's just a good thing to have for emergency situations. However, not all of these 988 calls are emergency situations, and they don't always warrant police tracking and hacking into your phone. And I would like to, just stop for a moment here to say what is probably obvious to anybody that's, that knows. This kind of thing can really, really validate and feed into paranoid delusions. This is not the kind of thing that people should be, that should be kept a secret. If you're going to be tracking a mentally ill person's location, you gotta let them know. Because this kind of thing is just going to validate and perpetuate and exacerbate certain paranoid delusions that people can be very vulnerable to. Surveillance does not equal safety. For some of our research participants, the threat of harm that accompanies location tracking and non-consensual intervention meant engaging in precautionary measures to protect their privacy, including hanging up. Just hang up the phone. 62.79% reported that they would not be comfortable sharing their level of suicidality or distress with a hotline if they knew their location could be tracked. 61.33% cited concerns about geographic location tracking as a reason for not using hotlines in the future. Yeah, people don't want to be tracked. Again, there's literally a very, very common and well-known paranoid delusion that can happen because of things like this, or based around things like this. And this is unfortunately real. You call for help and you don't know that you're getting tracked and you're getting police sent at you. This is like a nightmare scenario. And now we reach chapter 5. A better system is possible. Conclusion and recommendations. 988 hotlines are missing the mark on providing life-affirming care and are instead exposing help seekers to potentially harmful and life-changing consequences. The public deserves transparency about the impact of crisis services, and help seekers deserve crisis support that is consistently high quality, relevant, and consensual. All hotlines in the 988 network, and all hotlines in general, must commit to transparency, informed consent, and peer support, and must divest from harmful interventions that set the stage for help seekers to be criminalized, detained, and or hospitalized. Recovery does not happen in the isolation of a jail cell or a hospital bed. And the final pages of the report outline some recommendations for both the hotline system at large and the mental health system at large. So I highly recommend going into the description, download this report, go to their website for the supplemental information. I will leave those links down there. Share this with other people. Read this in detail. I've only gone over the most, main points, the most relevant things. But there's a lot of information here, a lot of statistics. These people worked very hard to gather this information and put it in a readable, easily digestible format. So I highly recommend, if you can, read this report in full, especially if you've ever used 988, and especially before you use 988 again, because we need to be informed about these things. A lot of this stuff is stuff that I did not know, or that I had to learn through experience, because, the only thing you're told about 988 is that it's a handy, convenient national hotline that you can call when you're in a crisis, and they will help you. But they have never helped me. I've called 988 probably dozens of times personally. And I have been coercively and involuntarily admitted to the hospital before. Multiple times. I've experienced police violence. I've experienced the lack of quality care that you get in hospitals. And at this point in my life, at 27 years old, I finally have decided I don't need to be involved in that stuff anymore. I can do much better on my own out here in the real world with people that love and care about me, as long as I can find those people. Truly, we have not advanced very far past the days of the asylums that people have made literal horror content about. And I think in 20, 30 years, people are going to be making similar content about the hospitals that we have today. And again, 988 is just a pipeline to those hospitals. The whole point of the phone call is to get you into an ambulance or in the back of a cop car so that you can go to the hospital, so that they can move on to the next person who's at imminent risk, or who they decide based on vibes is at imminent risk. Now, I wish I could say at the end of this video that if this has put you in a bad mindset and you feel the need to reach out for help, that there was a nice, convenient, and safe number that you could call. But unfortunately, 988 is probably not going to be it. There are alternative hotlines that you could call. Obviously, the Trans Lifeline that put together this report, you can call them. There's the Veterans Text Line, there's the Black Line, There's one for eating disorders. There's specialized hotlines for various different demographics that would probably be better suited for your specific needs. I would also recommend looking into your local warm lines. These are like hotlines, but they're warm, so they're not for like imminent danger cases. They're there for peer support. They're there for, local peer support and understanding, and they're more likely to actually take the time to sit and talk through things with you and resolve whatever emotions you're going through right there on the phone, rather than trying to send you to the hospital. I also recommend, obviously, find your community, right? Go to your local support centers that are specialized, LGBTQ centers and religious centers and cultural centers and things like that. Find the people that are going to support you on the ground level. So I'm not affiliated with translifeline.org. I didn't have any part in making this report. I may have participated in one of their surveys online a couple years ago or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm honestly trying to remember, because some of these quotes sound like they could have come directly from me. But I think that just indicates that this is a highly relatable experience. And that's why I'm sharing this, because I know that I'm not alone in this. So if you've ever called 988, especially if you've ever been hospitalized, let us know in the comments if you relate to any of this. If you kind of knew about this stuff, but you weren't really sure, maybe you had a hunch. That's how I felt about it. That my experiences with 988 and with the hospitalization system, I had a hunch that it just wasn't really working out. But of course, people will try to gaslight you into thinking that it's a you problem, that you just didn't want the help, or you didn't try hard enough, or whatever. Don't let that happen. This is a real report that is here for us to read and spread this information. This is a real thing that's happening. And that's why I'm making this video, because I want this information out there. I want people to know that if you feel this way about 988 and about the hospitals, you're not alone, and it is a valid way to feel. And I want people to be safe. People deserve to know this information. If you are going to call 988 or go to the hospital, you deserve to know the potential consequences before it happens. And remember that you deserve better. You deserve to be informed, you deserve to be healthy, and you deserve to be respected. Leave a comment if you relate, share the video to anybody this might be relevant to, maybe like the video, maybe sub if you'd like to. Check out the link in the description for the full report and the supplementary information. And I will have some links where you can support me in there as well. I am homeless. I'm just one autistic guy. Like I said, I'm not associated with Trans Lifeline. I just found this report on the internet, and I felt that it was important to share. And thank you so much for watching. Stay safe and have a peaceful day.